Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Nandini, and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for this year. A polemic is contentious rhetoric that is intended to support a specific position and undermine the opposing position. After hearing this definition, I'm sure you're thinking, boy, have I endured a lot of polemics since 2016. 3 years ago, Pew Research Center found that the 2016 presidential campaign was unfolding against a backdrop of intense partisan division and animosity. Today, this level of division and animosity has only deepened. In 2019, 55% of Republicans said Democrats are more immoral when compared with other Americans. 75% of Democrats said Republicans are more close-minded than other Americans. Polemic argumentation is not unique to the 21st century. Rather, it has a history that goes all the way back to the Protestant Reformation. Amanda Eurich, professor of history at Western Washington University and the author of Polemic's Purpose, will discuss how the practice of polemic in the Protestant Reformation polarized public discourse and civic society. Eurich suggests that the ways in which theologians on both sides of the religious divide, Catholic and Protestant, weaponized word and image against their rivals is a cautionary tale for the 21st century. Amanda Eurich has written widely about religious violence, the politics of coexistence, gender, and the wars of religion in early modern France. She is the author of numerous books, articles, and essays. She has also been the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Camargo Foundation, and most recently, the Meter Center of Calvin University. Her current research explores the radicalization of religious identity through the writings and correspondence of the 16th century jurist, John de Corus, known to Anglophone audiences as the judge who presided over the trial of Martin Guerre. Professor Eurich will present for about 40 minutes before jumping into conversation with me and Chris. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send a question, please state your affiliation with the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eurich to the Athenaeum.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really pleased to be with you this evening to talk about this issue that, clearly has real modern resonance for us. And so for the next 40 minutes, we're going to be thinking about the art and practice of polemic in the 16th century and its modern equivalencies. I already have been given an even more eloquent definition of polemic than the one I had proposed to begin with, which is that polemic is a strong verbal or written attack on someone or something. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century really begins with a polemical act. And here we see a modern rendition of that iconic moment when tradition holds that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Right? We all know that in October of 1517, in a fit of righteous anger, Martin Luther, at that moment, an obscure Augustinian monk teaching at the University of Wittenberg, penned 95 Theses in which he denounced the sale of indulgences. Luther was angry that Pope Leo X had authorized Dominican surrogates to sell papers bearing the papal insignia, promising purchasers freedom from the temporal punishments of sin. For Luther, the Pope, in essence, decided to traffic in salvation to fulfill an earthly goal of transforming the city of Rome into a new Jerusalem. Luther's dramatic gesture has inspired generations of political and religious reformers to reenact the moment in their own campaigns to reform church and society, including our own Martin Luther King. In 1966, this young civil rights reformer dramatically posted 14 theses or demands for an end to various institutionalized racist practices and, on the doors of the City Council of Chicago. in imitation, obviously, of his namesake's radical actions over 400 years earlier. And I think we see here the close connections then between polemic and political and religious activisms. Luther also took the precautionary measure of, sending his theses to German printers. And within weeks, Martin Luther's text went viral and triggered a torrent of words. A pan-European pandemic that ushered in the Protestant Reformation, fragmenting the spiritual unity of Christendom and polarizing public discourse and civic society for 100 years. So how early modern theologians weaponized words, mobilizing the new technology of the printing press, offers lessons, both good and bad, I think, for the 21st century. Polemic was integral to Reformation culture. It was a key weapon in the fierce combat for the hearts and minds of European Christians. Throughout the 16th century, theologians remained convinced of the power of words, their own words, as well as the word of God, to convict even their most obstinate opponents of divine truth. This ardent belief in the power of words stemmed in part from their training as humanists. The Renaissance rediscovery of Greek and Roman tradition inspired a new interest in classical rhetoric and oration, and the power of words to persuade. But as Peter Matheson has argued, this humanist belief in the transformative power of language gradually gave way to increasingly acrimonious debates from the pulpit and in print, and competing visions of reform and renewal. And as he says here, the declension of Reformation polemic into propaganda locked polemicists, and the emphasis is mine, in a zero-sum game in which defamation and demonization were the tools of the trade. Now, Protestant polemicists in particular defended the practice. They argued they faced the particular challenge of dismantling the established authority of the medieval church, whose rituals and practices were deeply embedded in daily life. Luther notoriously took aim at various religious practices, not just the sale of indulgences that he deemed corrupt, as well as the personalities who legitimized them, often using coarse language, scatological imagery, and profane references to denigrate his Catholic opponents. The literary critic Susan Morrison has called this Luther's fico-poetics. And she argues that, Luther's frequent references to flatulence and excrement, farts, and dung were an integral part of his stylistic. Luther had a particular talent for memorable zingers, especially when his target was the Pope in Rome, who he frequently called the Pope ass. In 1545, for example, and this Luther waxed eloquent in a late career treatise on the papacy, a treatise which he gave the unambiguous title, The Devil's Institution. And in one choice passage, he wrote that the Pope ass's anger towards Lutherans was so great that it caused him, and here I quote, to let out a thunderous fart, such a thunderous fart that it is a wonder it did not tear a hole in his anus and his belly, end quote. Now, what a remarkable quote. So let's think a little bit about what is happening here. Just like political references to Marco Rubio's little hands, Luther's references to the Pope's thunderous farts reminds us of the Supreme Pontiff's humanity. Okay? Thinking about this, it made me think of a child's book by the Japanese authors Taro Gomi, Everyone Poops, right? I mean, because in essence, that's what Luther is saying, everyone, even the Pope, farts. And there is a kind of equalizing effect behind such word images, which ultimately dethroned, or maybe an even better word is desacralized, the Pope and his mystic powers. Now, scatological references like these were gleefully adopted by printmakers who transformed Luther's words into graphic images that had the self-perpetuating power of internet memes. And here we have one by the German artist Lucas Cranach entitled The Papal Belvedere. And of course, we know belvedere means, a panoramic view. And here the Pope has a panoramic view of his of Luther's supporters, as Monty Python would say, farting in his general direction. Right? But belvedere also is a word that refers to the human behind. So there is a kind of double play on words that's going on here. Now Luther often collaborated with Lucas Cranach to transform his words into graphic images more easily accessible to popular audiences. And this is precisely what he's doing here. He and Cranach collaborate together to produce a series of grotesquely scandalous images of the papacy in 1545 that were meant to be a kind of companion to the treatise he had just produced, The Devil's Institution. I would argue this is the kind of graphic novel version of Luther's pamphlet on the papacy, right? And as we see here, right, we have supporters dropping their drawers, basically mooning the Pope, and farting in his direction. The Pope is Pope Paul III. He's holding a recent bull that he has published denouncing the so-called Lutheran heresy, and this bull is on fire because it comes from the fires of hell. Now, this reminds us that Renaissance traditions of satire also heavily influence Reformation polemical practice. Protestant reformers embrace parody and ridicule as useful tools to lay bare the fallacies of the opposition. And in works written both in Latin and in the vernacular, they use the seductive power of humor to align their readers to their underlying arguments. Now, one common target, there were many, was the veneration of holy relics. Right? Those ghostly remains of saintly bodies and sacred objects, pieces of the true cross, St. John's femur, even Christ's foreskin, that were on display in churches across Europe. And just as indulgences proffered false promises, kind of salvation and restoration, while reaping huge benefits for the church, so did relics. Now, Calvin in 1543 writes his treatise on relics. And the treatise was actually Calvin's first foray into the world of vernacular polemic. Most of his works previously had been written in Latin and targeted fellow clerics. And in this work, Calvin sounds familiar themes, in particular ridiculing the fraudulent proliferation of relics. How many heads of John the Baptist could there actually be? While criticizing the materiality and sensuality of popular devotion. And then he catalogs a long list of improbable relics, culminating with the most peculiar, I think, of all medieval relics, the Virgin Mary's breast milk. Those small reliquaries purporting to contain a crusty drop of the Virgin's milk were surprisingly common, as apparently they still are on eBay. So, while I was trolling around for images on the internet of the Virgin's milk relics, I found this one, a very rare reliquary shrine of the milk, of the miraculous kind of Virgin Mary, which we could procure for a mere $1,600 US. Now, Calvin too marvels at how many vials of the Virgin milk are on display across Europe. Writing that had the Virgin been a wet nurse her whole life or a cow dairy, she couldn't have produced more than is shown as hers in all of the ports of Europe. 2 years later, Martin Luther also produces a brilliant parody on the veneration and exhibition of relics. that he entitled The New Newsletter from the Rhineland. Now, the occasion was an exhibition that his arch nemesis, the Archbishop of Mainz, not only an avid promoter of indulgences, but also, an ardent collector of relics, was planning to organize, right? The Archbishop of Mainz was hoping to put his collection of relics on display in a local church in Mainz. And Luther uses the occasion to write a pamphlet, it's anonymous actually, that is really framed as an advertisement for this exhibit. And the advertisement promises all the marvels that the Archbishop is going to feature in this exhibition, including some of his newest acquisitions. And here Luther starts to have some fun. Right? The Archbishop is going to expose a recent relic that he has acquired, the 3 flames from the burning bush of Mount Sinai. And he goes on, 2 feathers and an egg from the Holy Spirit, a whole pound of wind from Prophet Elijah's cave, a weighty shout from the walls of Jericho. And then he just can't resist the temptation. He says the Archbishop has also decided to contribute a portion of his truthful tongue. Not. So again, let's think about what Luther is doing here, right? He's using this list of ephemeral or immaterial things to skewer the materiality of relics and the belief that the divine, the transcendent, can somehow be contained in objects of wood and stone. And at the same time, he gets to take a personal potshot at the Archbishop of Mainz. Now, reformers did emphasize that satire had its limitations, right? John Calvin will argue that Christianity can be discussed in 2 ways, right? That fundamentally it's okay to use satire when denouncing the superstitions of the opposition and the Catholic Church. But you have to be careful when you're talking about true religion, right? The pure truth. And so when you're talking about matters of divine kind of import, he says, or the Holy Scriptures, we can envision this is what he means, no jokes should come into the discourse, for the reverence we feel, he says, for his majesty. Now, I want to step back for just a second. Or maybe I want to say step forward just a second to talk about how, modern theorists in our own age think about polemics. And of course, it's in some ways quite different from the early modern world. This is a picture of the late, great French theorist Michel Foucault. Many of you know about him, I'm sure, who would argue in a celebrated interview in 1984 that polemics is, and polemic is the antithesis of truth. And those of us who live in an age of professional political spin doctors and alternative facts and fake news might be inclined to agree. But 16th century reformers would not have understood Foucault's postmodern attack on the art of polemic, because as they saw it, the defense of the truth was the guiding purpose of their endeavors. Luther, for example, prefaces his 95 Theses by saying, I penned them, and here I quote, out of love and my zeal for clarifying the truth. That said, I think that early modern reformers might have recognized themselves in Foucault's description of their tactics as a kind of no-holds-barred contest against an enemy whose very existence constitutes a threat. As John Calvin would explain, Christ had admonished his followers to prepare themselves for battle, since, quote, it's necessary to give witness to the truth, unquote. And on the other side, Antoine Duval, a quite prolific Catholic polemicist, would write that, he wrote his little tracts to teach his readers to recognize the enemy. So on both sides of the confessional breach, early modern polemicists recognized that they were engaged in a high-stakes game with immediate political as well as eternal consequences. And they openly address their polemical texts to princely patrons and in the hopes of soliciting their moral, but also their political and military support. In the Reformation, the practice of polemic was also a part of what historians have called confessionalization. And what historians mean by this is that process of creating new systems of beliefs and practice. As various Reformed communities consolidated and normalized their practices, they drew up what they called confessions that laid out the key tenets of their belief. And they often published these confessions. And Protestant reformers saw this process and even the polemical process they were engaged in as part of the effort to define and clarify and consolidate these doctrinal boundaries in their work. And this is a project that is going to bring them not only into conversation with Catholic opponents, it's going to bring them into conversations with members of their own party. Because by the 1520s, Protestantism starts to splinter. Luther opens a Pandora's box kind of possibilities when he successfully attacks the papacy and the most transcendent institution, the transnational institution of the Middle Ages, the church. So that, in less than a decade, Luther finds himself not only engaged in public disputes with Catholics, he also finds himself in public disputes with former supporters, correspondents, and friends. And one of the most famous of these disputes is the Colloquy of Marburg that is held in 1529. We're going to think about this as kind of representative of all of the colloquies that are going to be held in the 16th century. And there are many of them, right? In 1529, Philip of Hesse, a great German lord, invites Luther, and we can see Philip of Hesse sitting on a throne here. And on either side, we have Martin Luther, and then the Swiss humanist Ulrich Zwingli, who would increasingly begin to kind of question Luther's understanding of the celebration of the Mass and the Eucharist, right? Its significance, its meaning. And I'm not going to go into the theological subtleties here, but they were great enough for these two reformers to vehemently disagree with each other. And so we look at this, these reformers are going to come to the Castle of Marburg, flanked, by their theological seconds, to discuss this issue. Philip of Hesse hopes that they'll come to some kind of resolution, because this is an existential moment for the Protestant party. The armies of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, have gathered, along with the Catholic princes of Germany, and their intent is to crush the Protestant opposition, the Lutherans kind of Germany. And Hesse believes if the two can't make common cause, then the Protestant cause and union of Protestant princes is hopelessly fractured. Now, what happens? Zwingli opens with a really promising prayer, and let me just quote here, where he beseeches the Lord to dispel the clouds of misunderstanding with his gentle spirit and to bring an end to the strife of blind fury. That word itself, fury, suggests the intensity of this disagreement. But after 2 days of discussion, the two reformers agree to disagree, and not very nicely. And what is going to happen is that multiple colloquies will follow as the Protestant world tries to establish some kind of unity. This is a unity, a concord, a reconciliation that will never come. Now, over the course of the 16th century, the failure of these public disputations or colloquies to achieve consensus hardened confessional lines and increasingly polarized discourse. And what we see are even more reductive arguments in which opponents, even Protestant opponents, are identified not only as misguided, but as active agents of evil, in some cases as servants of Satan. Now, we see this, for example, in this pamphlet written by John Calvin, A Short Instruction to Arm all the Faithful Against the Errors of the Anabaptist Texts. Right? We know that mainstream reformers marshaled, as we're going to see here, gender and sexual innuendo to denigrate not only Catholics, but also radical reform movements, such as the Anabaptists. Anabaptists were known for promoting adult baptism, not infant baptism, but also for generous programs to the poor, sometimes even sharing, their own property in common. Although there was one radical group called the Munsterites that also promoted polygamy. They were really kind of outliers. But Calvin describes them in this text as representative of the whole, which certainly wasn't true, right? And in one passage, as he's denouncing the various errors of the Anabaptists, he says, well, they share their goods in common, but they also share their wives in common too, which was only true for one kind of outlying group. Here he calls upon contradictory cultural anxieties concerning female power and weakness, right? To trigger kind of real anxieties about the Anabaptist movement. I mean, people reading this could think, if we allow Anabaptists in our neighborhood, in our community, if we tolerate this, are we going to have to watch Sister Wives? Now, Catholic Protestants aren't alone in using sex and gender to denigrate their rivals. The Protestant, the propagandist priest Claude Hatton, also, right, played the gender card, claiming that Protestantism was the religion of women. And that's because women were easy targets, susceptible by their irrational and carnal natures to the casuistry of false preachers, especially those that flattered them that they could read and interpret the Holy Scriptures on their own. And so one common trope that we find in Catholic polemic is this figure of the femmelette, the little woman. And here we see kind of an image of a woman with the Bible open, apparently, preaching to or contesting the Catholic kind of body of Catholic clergy that are facing her, right? The little woman is or the femmelette is the woman who used her smattering of learning to challenge the spiritual monopolies of the largely male clergy. Now, early modern polemicists also leveled attacks against men, especially male clerics. On both sides of the divide, polemicists skewered the unbounded, unregulated sexuality of the religious leaders of the opposition. Right? We know that Luther and other Protestant reformers, of course, championed marriage and family life because he saw it as an antidote to clerical immorality. Since the 9th and 10th centuries, clergymen were supposed to marry, or not supposed to marry. They were supposed to take vows of chastity. And of course, many didn't observe them. But Catholics, in turn, accused Protestant pastors of championing marriage because of a kind of aggressive, hypersexualized manhood. Especially after Luther, a former monk, scandalized the Catholic world by marrying a former nun, Catherine kind of von Bora, and other Protestant reformers quickly followed his lead. These actions provided rich fodder for Catholic polemicists who continued for decades after the Protestant practice of clerical marriage was normalized to make hay of the situation. And one of my favorite pamphlets kind of in this regard is a tract entitled Portraits of Ministers. It circulates throughout southern France in the 1620s. And it's a long kind of catalog of all the sexual peccadillos of local ministers. But the most spectacular is a story of an oversexed pastor who stalks a young virgin and forces her into marriage and then brutally deflowers her on their wedding night. I mean, we would call this today marital rape. And sparing the reader no detail, the author describes this young woman's cries of anguish from the marriage bed in the face of her oversexed aggressor. So gender is not the only, it's a significant tool, right? That's used, it's mobilized by propagandists, but it's only one of a number of strategies used by early modern polemicists to discredit their religious rival. Another is crude comparisons to earlier heretical sects. that serve the same function by allowing authors to ascribe similar doctrinal affiliations and diabolical practices to their contemporary opponents. Luther was fond of accusing his critics of Pelagianism, which was a 4th century belief denounced as heresy by the early church father Augustine. And, Calvin, employed similar techniques against some of his rivals. They were really spiritual humanists, but he chooses to call them libertines. So there's this thread of, this veil of kind of dangerous sexuality that hangs over the movement. And he denounces them as heretical, that they're like the Donatists and the Gnostics of the kind of ancient world, who were also kind of described as sexual libertines. Catholic authors also, right, used this kind of link. And the Luke scholar, the French scholar, Luc Ricot, has argued that Catholic authors effectively linked Calvinists to the two arch heresies of the Middle Ages, Catharism and Waldensianism. Those of your historians might know these as kind of two heresies that emerge in the 12th and 13th century that are going to be, almost immediately condemned by the papacy. And here we have a 14th century text. And at the top, you see it says des Vaudoises, right? These are Waldensian women. And what are these Waldensian women doing? They're flying on broomsticks, right? They're witches. Right? So we're going to see in the 16th century too, this kind of, eliding of gender and heresy and witchcraft into very potent diabolical word images. Catholic polemicists also shamelessly recycled old, very old libels of gross immorality and cannibalism that had been leveled against Christians in the ancient world. And one of the most infamous of these trades on the fact that, French Protestants are prohibited, maybe we should say across the world, rival sects are prohibited often from worshiping in public. And so in France, Protestants meet privately in homes, often at night, to avoid detection. And a widely circulated rumor that we also find in print held that at such gatherings, sexual orgies took place, and that the children born of these illicit unions were routinely sacrificed during the secret celebrations of the Lord's Supper. Now, we have an account from Claude Pétu of riots that broke out at the site of one of these nocturnal assemblies in the Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris in 1556. And it's, we shouldn't be surprised, Pétu tells us that people immediately surrounded the house when they heard that these people had gathered there, and then tore at their hair and their clothes when they tried to flee through the streets. Because, we know how, right, rumors of satanic pedophile rings can lead to violence, right? And here, I just couldn't resist showing one of the signs that we find, one of many signs that we find at the Capitol riots, where the writers claim that QAnon sent them what, among other things, to purify the nation of this pedophile rings that clearly are operating in Washington, D.C. Renowned figures such as Luther and Calvin frequently found themselves subjects of religious invective too. And their efforts to counter their detractors underscore the highly personalized nature of early modern polemic. Right? Many scholars have argued that the battles that took place in print mimic in many ways the noble conventions of dueling, right? That someone publishes a treatise, it's an offense to your honor, and you have to respond with a counterattack, or kind of your reputation is lost. Right? But unlike dueling, which often ended in the death of one of the two parties, I mean, there was a kind of victory. In the print battles that wage in the 16th century, it's often difficult for anyone, even though they do, to claim a victory. In the last decade of his life, for example, John Calvin engaged in a number of one-on-one battles with his adversaries, one-on-one print battles in particular. Maybe feeling like he had to defend his personal reputation as well as his theological legacy at the kind of tail end of his life. And perhaps the kind of most famous of these is an ongoing controversy that he has with a former friend named Sebastiano Castellio. And here is an image that I just love that actually comes from a calendar I bought in Geneva, right? The homeland of Calvin, right? And it shows the two with boxing gloves on, right, prepared to fight, right? They did have personal battles, but this really evokes the battle that Castellio and Calvin are going to have in the early 1550s, long after Castellio has been banished from Geneva, partly at Calvin's behest. Castellio eventually finds his way to Basel. He's a very accomplished humanist. He publishes the New Testament in Greek. And in 1553, he writes a treatise denouncing John Calvin and his personal involvement in what becomes known as the Servetus affair. And he argues that the Spanish physician, Michael Servetus, who had written various works of a kind of anti-Trinitarian work that were deemed heresy by both Catholics and Protestants, had made his way to Geneva, where it is true he was arrested and then brutally tortured and executed. And Castellio says that the execution comes at Calvin's behest. As he writes, Calvin's hands are literally dripping with the blood of Servetus. Now, Calvin, of course, has to respond, right? And so he writes a response, a long kind of treatise against the doctrine of the Trinity that is, in a sense, a defense of Servetus's execution. And the work does gain a certain amount of traction in Reformed circles. You know, for many, the work establishes Calvin as the chief apologist for the Reformed movements and its doctrines. But it also is going to draw Calvin in the last decade of his life into all kinds of Trinitarian disputes with free thinkers across Europe. From, you know, the Netherlands to even further afield to Poland, Luther is constantly writing to try to defend his position. And this, I think, demonstrates this self-perpetuating nature of Reformation polemic. The temporary cessation of religious war at the end of the 16th century did not end the war of words. The 17th century becomes a kind of golden age of controversy. Stage debates become kind of confessional spectator sports that draw large audiences. And in the aftermath, each side published its own sectarian account of the encounter, followed by volleys of replies and counter replies in print. Early modern printers reaped the benefits of these polemical contests. But the failure of either side to gain traction gradually undermined the popularity of these events. And by the mid-century, theologians begin to call for a return to the gentle polemics of persuasion. The broader populace, too, was increasingly exhausted by the polemics of polarization. After a century and a half, the war of words and arms had not resolved confessional differences. But in some quarters, we began to see the begrudging acceptance of religious difference in a kind of lived experience of tolerance and coexistence. Well, what does this history of early modern polemics, you know, tell us? How does it speak to us in the 21st century, where we live in a polarized age marked by uncivil discourse, rampant conspiracy theories, self-perpetuating memes, and news cycles that depend on controversy and conspiracies to draw in viewers? Just like their 16th century counterparts, those who shape our information channels champion the necessity of polemic to expose falsehoods, to fortify the resolve of the faithful, and to enlighten and entertain, because let's be honest, there is a certain entertainment value, right, to watching 21st century blood sport, political blood sport. Okay? As was said in the introduction, what I think we can learn from Reformation practice is largely cautionary. I want to emphasize that Reformation practice maybe reminds us not to underestimate the power of belief. Right? That early modern polemicists were not just speaking their truth, they believed they were speaking transcendent truths, and that made and makes today compromise very difficult. Early modern polemical practice reminds us of the power of rumor and innuendo and the sticking power of nicknames and graphic word images, especially if they trigger pervasive cultural anxieties. And here, among all these nicknames and terms that circulated, in the last two election cycles, the one that I really want to focus on is the word deplorable, right? Which, came from John Podesta's leaked email describing the supporters of Trump, and then became adopted by the supporters of Trump as a kind of badge of honor and a rallying cry. Because, right, it spoke to certain cultural and social and economic anxieties. These nicknames remind us that polemic naturally seems to bend towards the personal, even in the most abstract of exchanges, that ideas and social visions are linked to our identities and the possibilities that we see for ourselves. Even in the guise of peacemaking, polemic often only appeals to the base and rarely wins converts. But I hope the early modern experience also suggests that even the entertainment value of polemical contests may fade, that the intensity of pugilistic encounters is exhausting even in print, that sometimes the audience begins to yearn for an end, maybe because they just are tired of the debilitating war of words and the escalation of conflicts and disruptions in daily lives. And on the ground level, people begin to themselves craft ways of living together cheek by jowl with their former enemies. So I'm going to end with the question, what do we think our trajectory might be? And maybe that will be a way to start the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that the first question I was actually going to ask is what you believe the trajectory to be. But if that's too broad of a question,
well, I have to say that reading the history of the 16th century, it may be hard to feel a lot of hope, right? But I guess I can also, as I said, read it in another way, which is that eventually, I think people begin to long for, people long for solutions and for ways for things to work. And in some ways, I mean, I think this is part of the discourse we're having right now, right? With a new president and, and the ongoing crises that we can continue to face. There is this discussion about what, a desire not from the top, but maybe that desire from the bottom will bring about some kind of more positive change. Will it in the age of the internet and the kinds of possibilities offered by social media platforms, and the kind of tribalization that all kinds of scholars of modern culture emphasizes the world in we live in? Will that be enough? I hope so. I hope that there will be a kind of groundswell of support for practical solutions that allow people to be able to resolve, if not the problems of kind of high politics and culture, then the kind of basic problems that we face every day. Yeah, feeding our families, um, having access to kind of fair housing. Um, and, my hope would be the 16th century doesn't give us hope for this, but that even kind of faith institutions and other kinds of social institutions would become involved in helping to create spaces where this could happen and in helping to create communities where this would happen.
The next question is, what do you think is different or similar about polemics from the past in comparison to polemics of the present?
Yeah. Well, I hope that the presentation indicated, various ways, at least obliquely, that the practices haven't changed, right? We often say, the French phrase "plus ça change," plus c'est la même chose, right? I mean, the more it changes, more it's, the more it's the same. I mean, we still see, just as in the 16th century, the way in which gender and sex can be mobilized to demonize the opposition, and we still see the kind of reductive kind of arguments that also seem to work to gain a kind of traction. And I mean, that was certainly true of the 16th century, and we see it's true in the 20th century as well. And I could say that we have very different technologies, but the printing press in the 16th century, is this new technology, right? That is as transformative of course, as the digital kind of revolution of the 20th century, and it makes it possible for polemic to spread rapidly and to gain a kind of traction, because as I said, within a few weeks, students are taking copies of Luther's 95 Theses and squirreling them in their knapsacks and going to Paris and to other great university centers. And we have this kind of explosion, of discussion. So it's not as fast, right, as the rapidity of transmission, right, is slower certainly in the 16th century. But by comparison, right, to contemporaries, it seemed fast, it seemed unstoppable, and it seemed clandestine. It seemed mysterious. How can we, just as we talk about the kind of the internet and social media, I mean, how can we get a hold of these and identify these groups that are developing and proliferating and spreading these ideas, right? Depending on your perspective, ideas that are noxious and dangerous, or ideas that are great and liberating.
Could
Yeah.
could fracturing the two political parties in the United States be a positive thing for polemics and civility and discourse?
I hope so. I'm not sure that we want to go towards a parliamentary tradition. There are, as a historian of France, I can talk a lot about the potential, certainly in the 20th century, the potential problems of a parliamentary system. And I have lived, right, through the potential problems of a parliamentary system where 18 people are running for president in France, and 4 of them are members of the fractured kind of communist party. But, I do think that we need to find a place. I've long thought, think that we need to find a place for multiple perspectives and viewpoints, and for parties that represent that. I mean, frankly, I don't. I have to say that there are positions that I personally hold that are not fully represented either by the Republican or kind of Democratic Party. So I would like to see some restructuring of the two-party system. In some ways it works. Those of you who are political scientists can, argue, I'm sure, give me a vigorous argument against that. But can we, even in the public sphere, have space for, viewpoints that are broader than those represented by Democrats and Republicans. I mean, at the edges of both parties, for good and for bad, I think we're beginning to see this, as we're beginning to see some kind of traction in the long history of anti-communist and anti-socialist sentiment in the United States.
How do you think the internet has changed the nature of discourse today?
Well, I think it's changed the nature of discourse in the same way that, the printing press and polemic changed the, nature of discourse in the 16th century. I mean, I think it's obviously made our public discourse, but also our personal discourse, meaner and spare, and devoid of nuance. Right? I mean, I'm not saying anything that many of you haven't thought, and that certainly political pundits and commentators don't say on a regular basis. But again, it's so easy to be drawn into these kinds of contests where. And especially, I mean, certainly with tweets, with Twitter as well. I mean, how can you encapsulate nuance, right, in a tweet? You can't. And so people are just lobbing these nastygrams at each other, and it's troubling. It's troubling to me. Yeah.
Can you comment on polemics in non-Christian contexts, both historically and in present day?
Yeah, I think, I mean, briefly anyway, right? I mean, I think that Nandini had an excellent comment on that when she talked about what we've been facing it kind of in the last two election cycles, right? It's, I mean, polemic, in the Reformation, polemic uses a kind of rich vocabulary of both the classical world and also the Christian world. But polemicists can draw on all kinds of traditions, kind of, and they do, and we have an example of this, in our own political process. But I do think the one thing that's kind of interesting as a historian of religious culture is the kind of enduring appeal of religious imagery, right? At least in the West, where I think it's increasingly less true, as kind of some historians have said, we live in a post-Christian world, but increasingly less true in a world in which Christianity may be kind of less dominant. But there are the power of these images, and I'm really interested. I'm interested in what new kinds of images and references gain traction. Certainly in the modern world, I think that a lot of these references are references to popular culture. And the interesting thing there too is that then these become references that are generational dividing lines, because if you're not on those channels, or you're not listening to those podcasts, or you're not going to those spaces, you have no idea what the conversation is about. And that kind of exclusion can be useful too, right? It can be a polemical tool, right? That kind of inwardness of polemic is itself a force of exclusion.
Before we close, do you have any parting thoughts for our audience?
Well, I think that my parting thought is, what will you do, and how will you think about reaching across the divides that you experience in your life, and how, what will you do to think about how we might move towards repairing the huge political chasm that exists in our country today. I I don't subscribe to the belief that of some that we're on the verge of a civil war. But we have always lived in a society where political discourse has been vibrant and vehement and violent. And those periods where it has not been, in some ways, are kind of anomalies. But it does challenge us as people kind of living in a world where we have the right to express our opinions, to think about ways kind of to express them that allow us also to try to think about community, right? How can we express our ideas and promote our ideas, but not necessarily at the expense of community? Thanks. Thank you.
On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Professor Eurich and to all of those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be next Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Gabrielle Calvo-Coresi will speak to us on how to craft economies of care in poetry. Thank you all and have an amazing evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.